Welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices. As organisations deal with the VUCAD environment, there's an increasing need to develop a more collective approach to business health, growth and momentum. One leader, one CEO, one executive is surely not enough. The age of empowerment is upon us. Our people are ready. They're ready to step up and go beyond their job description, regardless of their level. They're also ready in role to take more responsibility, to solve problems, to have ideas, to lead actions forward. Leadership at all levels can become the reality many have been striving for. It's been spoken of in corporate corridors and Zoom screens for so long, but so rarely executed well. So where can we learn from? Well, perhaps a very unexpected source, the British Army. One might think empowerment in a hierarchical structure like the armed forces just wouldn't fly, but how wrong we would be. James Cross takes us on an enlightening journey into the reality of a modern Western military force in terms of mission command, driving empowered initiative at all levels. Communication being the glue and a mutually supporting structure between the hierarchy and the troops on the ground. James provides us with a compelling case to finally bring in a bold new age of empowerment to make smart leadership at all levels the reality we've been talking about for decades. Let's hear more. Hello and welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices, and what an interesting episode we have for you today. James, thanks so much for joining us. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your military career and your current role at Duke Corporate Education.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeremy. So my background was, after leaving university, I served 16 years as an infantry officer, got to travel all around the world to different places. But most critically for my own development, I served on 6 operational tours, the most recent being in Afghanistan in the role as a company commander. But since then, I got married, wanted to start a new chapter in my life, came to London to do work in financial services. But I found something was slightly missing, and that led me to the door of Duke. And what really attracted me at Duke and in my current role was the fundamental importance about leading people. And that's something that's very clear to my purpose, and is something that's very aligned with Duke, and the power that you can get from developing people and the impact it has upon organisations. So currently I'm a design director at Duke CE, and what that means is I'm responsible for designing the programs that we roll out to our participants and organisations, and I also manage the global education network, so making sure that we're bringing the right people for the right programs to the right clients.
Well, we share a focus on leadership for sure, and I'm hoping as people listen to this or watch it, they reach out and get in touch with you, James, because I know you're doing great things there at Duke CE. And leadership at all levels is a section, if you like, or a category of leadership that we seem to talk about a lot, but we don't ever seem to get right in business. The conditions have to be right at organizational level. We need the structures in place to unleash individuals. And when I got talking to you about this, I didn't really think of the army as being empowering because, of course, of the hierarchical structure. But once you started to explain what was happening there, I got really interested. So I'd like to ask you to explain in your own words what corporate enterprise can learn from the armed forces, in your experience, in terms of building a culture of empowerment, particularly if it is a more hierarchical body like the army, because I think cross cultures, we've got that situation still there, and creating the conditions for it to work in reality, of course.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I fundamentally, we have a command philosophy in the military of mission command. And what that means is empowering your people to execute whatever the unifying purpose is or the commander's intent. What that enables you to do, and we've learned the hard way through conflicts historically in the past, that it enables people to use their initiative and seize on fleeting opportunities as they present themselves. And invariably, those fleeting opportunities will happen at the lowest levels or on the periphery. And if you don't seize on those, then you can miss your opportunity, and that can have catastrophic consequences. And in order to have that command philosophy and get it through, it needs to be through that entire organization. And I believe that comes down to 4 key factors, which is communication, initiative, example, and loyalty. And I can elaborate on those further. But in terms of communication, you've got to ensure that everybody understands the higher commander's intent. And as at the top of the chain or at the bottom of the chain, you should be spending sort of 60 to 70% of your time really ensuring that that message goes through, that there's no confusion about what you have to achieve. You're not telling people how to achieve it. You're leaving that up to their ingenuity, but you're freeing them up to say that is the effect, that is the unifying purpose for us all. But that's also a responsibility on you as a subordinate to be, if you have any doubt in your mind, to be questioning and making sure you are. So it's a two-way relationship. And I always say, there's no point coming up a higher commander, coming up with a plan of Napoleonic genius, if the people who are going to have to enact it don't really understand what they've got to do. And that's where you end up with decision paralysis. You've also got to engender a culture of initiative. So you've got to enable people and reward them for taking initiative. And risk is, in that very approach. But the third thing is also example. You've got to be embodying those, every leader, those examples that you are doing what you say, and because by doing that, you create confidence in people, and whether that's the highest standards of execution to integrity to moral courage, people who do that engender confidence at all levels, and it also creates that psychological safety in an organization, which is absolutely critical for this to work. And then the final thing is loyalty, and this isn't just loyalty in terms of blind obedience. This is loyalty all the way up, going both ways. So from the senior commander has loyalty to those people. He's not going to put them at undue risk without consideration, but also that those people have loyalty to the people beside them, people below them, and the people up. And then you are truly functioning as a team, which has all the benefits of psychological safety and also speed and agility.
Well, it seems to me, James, that corporate can learn so much from this, and particularly from those four aspects that you talk about when you look beyond mission command. So the communication, which is all important, the initiative that can be driven throughout the organization, the example and leading by example at all levels, of course, and of course, then the loyalty that engenders, not just by the troops to their leaders, but their leaders to their troops. So it does strike me that there's an extra question here, which is, what was your impression when you left the military and you walked through the corporate doors for the first time and you observed leadership? Because I'm sure it wasn't exactly as you described this culture.
I found it was very hierarchical. People were very much within their swim lanes and they didn't step out of it. And it just struck me that people weren't being used to their full potential. And people who were very bright, very capable, those potential just weren't allowed to exercise it for whatever reason that was in that culture. And I just thought, it's not an efficient use of resources. Whereas indoctrinated in the military, you never have enough resources to do what you want to do. And you've got to think creatively, and you've got to be proactive and step up. And you're always, all the way through training to every role, you're just at the edge of your comfort zone. And as soon as you get really good at it, you're moved on to the next piece, and that's your continual development. But it sort of, maybe I was naive, but it surprised me at how people weren't tapping into that potential. And also, the role of a leader is a talent catalyst, effectively. So it's not being at the top issuing direction, it's sort of sitting in the middle in an ecosystem, and you change your position depending on the circumstance. But the one thing that does remain constant is you're always developing the people below you, and you're enabling them to be on the edge of their comfort zone. But that doesn't absolve you of accountability or responsibility. It's almost, I almost think the analogy of it's a bit like a young parent with a toddler on a bicycle, and you've taken the stabilizers off. You don't want them to fall, so you're just behind, but you also want them to feel that they're in control and they're doing something. But your responsibility as a parent is just to be there to catch them when they start to topple.
Great analogy, James. Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more around this. And I'm the naive one, I have to admit, because my perception when I think armed forces is more command control, hierarchical, but it seems to be flipped completely in reality. And based on your experience, of course, your experiences in the corporate world are very similar to mine, and the perception that I had and the need for leadership at all levels and driving that down. So maybe I can go into that a little bit further with you from your personal experiences, the specific situations where you found that the armed forces as a whole or your company benefited from empowered people at all levels, with some examples.
Well, I think, there are loads of examples from training and from operations. I think for me, the most challenging tour was Afghanistan. And that was for various different reasons. We were operating in a non-benign environment. Resources were quite thinly spread. We're having to rely on communications. Physically, people were spread all over the place, so you weren't all combined as one force, and so that makes communication more challenging. It also makes the morale component, as in how do you keep people motivated, focused, and not letting discipline slip, more challenging. But also, you're relying on, with that force structure and that layout on the ground, you really have to trust your subordinates to be able to make decisions and do things, because they're going to be ones that will have to. And as I mentioned earlier, these opportunities are fleeting, so you have to trust the judgment. Now, you get a lot of time to prep for that in training, and you put people through these scenarios and etc. But on the day, you have to trust that person and you have to support them, because they have the they're at the coalface, they can see the thing, they've got much more information than you could have. If you waited and tried to control everything, and sometimes you have the ability to, and especially in Afghanistan, it was very tempting, because you have things like live video feeds right down to the sort of soldier level. Actually, that's the thing you have to resist to do, because just because you can control doesn't mean you should be controlling, because you could actually end up just stifling initiative and stifling the tempo and agility. And I can think of countless scenarios where we just had to rely on a young soldier who has seen something, made a decision, and then we have to support that, because it's where those fleeting opportunities that you'll then be able to exploit through. But for that to work, that's where I come back to that point about loyalty, trust, and communication.
As you were going through that, James, you talked about dispersed teams, enforced structure, trusting subordinates, because they're the ones that do it, try not to over control. You could have been talking about April 2020 in corporate enterprise globally, and the need to shift how we work traditionally with a very, very new lens. And you've been doing it, creating that template, and it clearly works. So it's very interesting to me that leaders and commanders within the armed forces, from a mindset point of view, really kind of buy into this, first of all, but also understand the clear benefits of doing that from a more broader distributed leadership perspective. And was that your own experience of being a captain, being in command of a unit?
Very much so, because it also comes down to confidence in yourself and self-awareness, both your strengths and your weaknesses, and realizing, being comfortable with, first of all, ambiguity, and second, that you don't have all the answers. And once you are confident with that, you then have that reassurance that you have a team around you to help you. It's not just down to you. And people often refer to the loneliness of command, and that's true to one extent, but I never really experienced it. You ultimately have to make a decision and give direction, and there's a responsibility, but you have a whole team around you to support you and want you to succeed, because you're operating in an environment that has been created to allow that to happen. And everyone's interdependent on each other. So I always felt in real times of pressure, I actually felt a sense of calm, because I knew that it wasn't all on me. I had to compute it all and bring it together and give direction, but there were lots of other people who were capable that could help me to do that. And I think that comes down from, when I reflect on it, it's the key thing there is humility.
Yeah, and just find that very interesting when you talk about it's not all on me. It's not a mindset that I see in the corporate space so much. And we talked about kind of what's happening and what your experiences were when you stepped through those corporate doors. And maybe I can ask you for a little bit more insight now, because it's clear that you really can see this from a broad point of view. So as you stepped into the corporate world and as you saw this more hierarchical approach, this sort of non-traditional approach to leadership in many ways, as I now see the armed forces in some ways, why do you think that empowering leaders at all levels has been such a rare commodity? What are the reasons behind it?
Because I think fundamentally it comes with risk and it's hard work. The rewards are enormous if you get it right, because you'll have a team that you're using people to their full potential. They're able to enact initiative in a controlled environment. They can give you lots of solutions. You're just tapping into all that creativity and agility and proactiveness. The downside to get that really right is you have to have a real understanding, and this is where it's hard, of your people's capabilities. Because everyone will have strengths and different levels of development, and that involves a lot of investment of time to build up that bond. And I think people don't want to invest that time, or don't feel they have the time to have other priorities to do it. Now in the military, it's quite clear that isn't a luxury. You have to, and you're reported and you're measured on it, and how you do that and how you develop your teams. And ultimately, when you go on operations, it proves dividends. That is the correct approach. But I think there is also a risk, and it depends on the culture of your organization. How does your organization reward? Does it reward results, or does it reward decisions? And in my view, the military teaches you very much to fail fast and pick up and learn from those lessons. But as long as those decisions have been made rationally, with a logic behind them, you reward people for being decisive and doing something, because doing something is better than doing nothing in that environment. But if you just reward on results, what you inadvertently do is create a culture of risk averseness, and then people won't, and if they're being reported on that, then they won't invest that time in their people. They'll be just focused on the result and the least risky approach to take that, which will stifle initiative and will effectively provide opportunities for your competitors, etc., or disruptors.
This is golden, James. This really is, because I too reinforce a number of the things that you've been talking about there within a business change and transformation context. So, for example, people being able to work at the edge of their capabilities, being able to experiment, fail fast, fail forward, those kind of things. But I absolutely love that statement around rewarding decision-making and that almost that courage to make decisions and move forward versus results, and support that process as they're going through it. That's really, really important. Now, you touched on some of the benefits that might give, but if I sort of put a leader in front of you and ask you to say, look, what are the kind of few key benefits that come out of the hard work that this will be to get this in place in your organization to drive this new age of empowerment, but what will they get out of it in terms of benefits if they do it right? Well,
first of all, they will get discretionary effort of people, because fundamentally, whatever endeavor we take part in as humans, we want to be valued as part of a team, and that someone's developing and investing in us. And if you're operating in an environment where this is going on and you're being empowered and you're being developed and in a safe environment, you will return that favor in terms of discretionary effort, because you can see there's real purpose, there's real clarity and integrity to what you're doing, and you want to be part of that success. So it engenders immediately a very tight bond in any team, I would argue. And then the benefits of that are that if you are communicating at all levels, both up and down, horizontally, really efficiently, you will be able to seize opportunities, which will always appear at the edges of any organization, but you'll be able to spot them and you'll be able to do something about them, or discard them. That may be a red herring, but you're constantly looking at the horizon and you're challenging orthodoxies. Can we do things? And you've created this really sort of energetic, agile organization that is all working towards one unified purpose, which is ultimately efficient. So I think you get, in my view, three things. You get discretionary effort from people, you unleash the potential, and you rapidly or massively increase your potential for agility.
Yeah, fantastic. And it resonates with me very strongly, this, for obvious reasons, of course, but that unique perspective that you bring into this really unclouds and unfuzzes the mindset around this. And it's a conversation that I would urge leaders to have more with you. So I'm going to take a leaf out of your book now, James. I'm going to create my own mission command, all right? And I'm going to put you in charge. And I'm going to paint you a picture, okay? You're now mission command in a major corporate. Your task is to bring in a new age of empowerment. So what are the things that you would need to have in place to start with that would drive success? And what do you need from those other leaders and your lieutenants underneath you that support that process of implementation?
So I think the first thing would be to develop trust amongst the organizations, really get to know what makes people tick, and look at the rehumanizing of it in terms of, what are we ultimately here for? What do we want to get out of things? And get that team bonding. So once you understand the people and their strengths and weaknesses, and you get that level of trust, then you've got the foundations to build upon it. The next piece I would look at, which I touched on earlier, is what is the reward structure in the organization? Because we may be talking about this, but if we're rewarding in an opposite way, then it's going to never fail, never succeed. So that would be the second thing I would look at. And then it would be very much leading by example. So proving that you believed in this, you were actually enacting it, and you were rewarding people for these behaviours and changes in approach. So I think those would be the first three things. But then it would be it's which is slower, but it's developing the psychological safety and demonstrating and rewarding that, whilst at the same time creating that culture where people don't feel they have to have a definitive answer. So I would describe it as trying to turn people into poker players rather than chess players. That, as in a game of chess, you can see an outcome, you can follow a certain route, and you'll get almost a secured end state. Whereas poker, you're weighing up the odds, and sometimes you'll lose, but if you play the game long enough and you work about it, you'll ultimately succeed. But it's been comfortable in that ambiguity of you don't necessarily always have the answers. And in the military, we're always trained to work on the 30-70 rule, that you shouldn't make a decision with only 30%, with less than 30% of information, but 30% is good enough to make a viable call and an informed guess. 70% is about as good as you're ever going to get. If you wait for more, you're going to be overwhelmed by events, and you'll ultimately fail. And more agile players will take advantage of that. And I think the last thing I would say is, in my view, in military and outside, the people who have been the most successful leaders and have the most created the greatest culture, the people who see risk as an opportunity and not as something to try and avoid. So it's increasing your risk appetite and comfort with that, without becoming a gambler, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I absolutely love that analogy of poker players versus chess players. I've not thought of it that way before, but it's absolutely fantastic. And I totally get the 30-70 piece as well, because speed these days can be competitive advantage in business, as we know. And we talk about sort of 70% solution being okay. You're talking about a 30% solution being okay. Now that's agile. And that's really different mentality. But of course, these things we have to get right. And there is a dark side of empowering others, I'm sure. And from your experience, because it's so rich, James, of what needs to be in place, how it is executed, and particularly what you were talking about there, reinforces those four key elements that you talked about early on: the communication, the initiative, the example, and the loyalty, building trust, the structure, the reward, leading by example, of course, and that psychological safety that brings it around. But perhaps when some of those are missing, there are watch outs there. So if we do get things wrong, what is the dark side of empowering others? What can happen if people fail?
Well, this all comes down to accountability, and you're not often people misunderstand mission command as I've given clear direction. Why did that person not do something? And that is in my mind, there's been a breakdown in communication somewhere along the line. So you have to constantly ensure that communication is clear. But equally, you've got to have moral courage to call out bad behaviours, because there's no point talking about this. You just need, if one person's not buying into it, they've been empowered, but they can actually effectively act as a cancer in the organisation. And so you just have to be watchful of calling that out. And, and that can be challenging if that person is your top performer, or, has got a lot of credibility. But it comes back to that point about not tolerating talented jerks in an organisation. You've got to rip that out, and because it's bad for the rest of it. But I suppose in long-winded way, it's moral courage, to me, is absolutely critical to call out those bad behaviours, but also to make sure the communication is clear, because the worst case scenario is people start behaving in a consent and evade method. And I've seen that in the military, where people agree, there's very clear direction, but they've got to a point where they're empowered enough that they're overconfident in their abilities, and they start to make their own decisions. And that's something you've always got to watch out for that doesn't happen, because consent and evade, they may be doing it for well-intentioned means, but ultimately they might not see the bigger picture of something, and they can have huge unintended consequences from doing that. So I'd say that was the major pitfall. You just have to be vigilant for bad behaviours when they start to creep in, and you've got to stamp down that. And also people taking shortcuts as well, because the military, it's very obvious. There is no benefit from shortcuts apart from risking soldiers' lives. And I've seen it on many occasions where people have got confident. The most dangerous time on an operational tour is in your last few weeks, because people are confident. They stop sometimes following the drills, or they take shortcuts because they've just repeated doing things, and that's when the casualties can mount up, or you can find yourself in a potentially catastrophic situation.
Yeah, I love that consent and evade, and I totally understand that in the corporate world as well, to be perfectly honest. And just a follow-up question on that: if that you talk about the cancer that can be created within an organisation where you have individuals who don't play ball, who fail fast but don't learn from it, and so on. What happens if that's at the very top of the organisation, and what do you do about that?
Well, then that becomes, that is the ultimate challenge. If you have a toxic, but it's never going to work, this approach, because you will not have psychological safety. You will not. It'll filter all the way down, and people will immediately go into a self-preservation mode, and therefore you cannot enact that behaviour of mission command and initiative, and because you've lost any psychological safety. And so ultimately that is something that, in my view, boards should look very closely at, of have you got the right people in the senior position, and are they showing the right behaviours? And I think that the financial crisis brought that to the fore, of people who had been rewarded on results but not necessarily behaviours. And that had filtered down throughout all organisations. And you see that you see that in every walk of life. So that comes to my point about example, that, if you are appointing someone as CEO, are they a person of integrity? Do they have the moral courage to make the big decisions and call out those behaviours? And are they leading by example? And if they are, then you'll have you've got the building blocks to have a really healthy, vibrant organisation that can tap into its full potential. But if you don't, you're doomed to fail from the start.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point that you make about the responsibility for boards as well. As a non-exec director myself, and understanding the governance responsibilities and accountabilities that are in place, unfortunately, around me sometimes on the boards that I've been on, I really see kind of that old school mentality still coming through at that level as well. So if they can't police, if you like, the leaders in an effective modern way, then the rapid road to failure is right in front of them. So it's a very good point to make sure that they are current, they understand what it means to lead a modern workforce, an ever-changing business in transformational times. But it's a hard job at that level as well.
Well, yes, and it's very easy to sort of say it, but I think it's and you can in good times, and this is the same in the military. You can get away with it with if you're producing results and it's stable and it's an environment. It's always in a time of crisis when you need those behaviours from top leadership and all the way through the organisation that a company's worth or an organisation's worth comes to the fore, good or bad, and how that organisation handles the crisis.
Yes, well said. And James, we've come to the end of our chat here, and what a discussion it has been. It's been inspiring, and I wrote the book apparently on leading at all levels, but you have added so much more richness to this and gone into depth in areas that I must admit I've touched upon. But this takes it to a whole new level, and I think the learnings that you brought into this really make part two. Certainly give me a very solid foundation, but it really is the lessons for leaders everywhere and organizations in what this means in reality. There are definitely lessons to learn from the armed forces. So what would be your parting words? And James, I'm sure people will want to get in touch. So how do they get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, my parting words is I think the key mantra I've always adopted and was told to me very early on when I was at the academy is never tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and they'll surprise you with their ingenuity. And that's fundamentally how do you get ordinary people to do extraordinary things that's often against their best interest. So that's always been my mantra. I mean, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, obviously you can find me via LinkedIn or on the Duke CE website. Find me under the people, and I'm more than happy to chat to anyone or explore any sort of issues that we've raised further.
Great. We'll make sure at the end of this on screen, you'll see James's details if you're watching it, but also reach out to us if you didn't catch that and you need James's detail. We'll be happy to make that connection. James, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolutely fabulous episode. I'm sure so many people are going to get a lot out of this.
Well, no, thank you, Jeremy, for having me.
A pleasure. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining our Guest Practices videocast. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel through the link below, or check out our website to access more in our current series of expert interviews.